Hi, everybody. Joanna here. Today I'm going to be talking about rereading books because I ended up rereading several books in 2023. Now, some of them I did plan to reread, but several I did not plan to reread, and it just kind of happened. Now, I'm going to go ahead and talk about why I reread these books, and also, I'll be going through each of the books in a very general way, talk about how I felt about the book the first time I read it, how I felt about it upon reread, and then I'll be talking about the results overall at the end of the video. But first, why I reread these books. Some I planned, including the A Song of Ice and Fire read slash reread along, which I'll be getting into. But the others I did not plan. I think part of it was just nostalgia. Even with the A Song of Ice and Fire reread, I think I just wanted to return to those characters, to that world, to that experience. So there was that factor. And I should go ahead and say that all these books were favorites the first time I read them. So rereading them was a little easier knowing that I enjoyed them the first time, but I was nervous about whether my reading taste had changed because I know I attend to different details now than I did back in the day when I read these books the first time. And I've read more books since I've read some of these books. So I wanted to know how that impacted my reread experience, whether I could be trusted upon first read with these books, and whether that would change the second time around. So I'll go ahead and get into the books I read. The first of these being A Song of Ice and Fire. So I did have A Song of Ice and Fire read slash reread along 2023 that I co-hosted with some lovely people. I should say that when I read these books the first time, and I'm sorry if you've all heard this story before, but I did read them before the show came out, or maybe right around the time season one was coming out. So I read all five before watching the show. And I think that that was very helpful for me because I wasn't, spoiled for certain things, as most people are nowadays who try the series the first time, and I was so impressed with this series upon my first read. I'll start with The Game of Thrones. This book won me over at around page 80 in the mass market paperback. It was in Bran's chapter when he's exploring Winterfell. I was so impressed with the Winterfell setting from a child's perspective, and then the crazy thing that happens at the end of that chapter. So that was the moment that hooked me, and I'll never forget it. But I was immediately drawn into the world and into the characters and just impressed with how many characters were introduced and how I was invested in all of them by the end of the book. So upon reread, I have to say this one definitely held up 100%. This one was very special upon reread because just going back to the beginning again, going back to Winterfell at the beginning, I won't give away any spoilers, but just to be back with the Starks at the beginning of the book when they're young, before everything happens, getting to know the characters for the first time and also seeing the foreshadowing at play, knowing where things go later in the series was so incredible. So that was a powerful experience for me upon reread, just noticing the foreshadowing elements, also noticing some broader themes which I talk about in my review of this first book if you want to check that out. Now, with The Clash of Kings, that particular book was special because of the prologue. I do remember it the first time I read the series. I remember being very immersed in A Clash of Kings, that second book, but I think upon reread, it really surprised me how much the prologue tied into everything else. I think all the prologues do that in A Song of Ice and Fire, but that was the most notable for me because upon reread, after I finished the prologue, I ended up writing a whole bunch of notes and even doing a little sketch in my journal. And then I did a spoiler gush of the prologue here on the channel. And it was amazing to me to make all these connections to what happens in the story, which I know I didn't do the first time I read that book. So there were just certain things I appreciated more. But again, I loved the book the first time. So it was wonderful both times. And then with The Clash of Kings, I was so surprised how many climactic moments happened in that book. I remembered them very vividly the first time I read them. I think because when I was rereading the book, I was preparing for a discussion, so I started trying to list them, and I lost count at a certain point. There were so many climactic moments. There were so many things I thought happened in book 4 that turned out to happen in book 3. So it was interesting just how my memory was not very reliable upon reread, but I loved it both times again. And then book 4 with A Feast for Crows lived for the Cersei chapters. I did a Cersei video in case you want to watch. Loved her the first time I read the book, but knowing how much of a role she played in A Feast for Crows made me just pay further attention to her. Again, I loved her both times, but it was just nice to notice those details. It's nice to just go back and notice certain details. A Dance with Dragons, that one was probably a little bit more intense emotionally the first time I read it, but it was still intense for me the second time I read it with certain things that happen. Now, I think most people would think I'm a very gullible reader to interpret certain events the way I did because I hadn't seen the show when I watched it, so I was believing certain things that I thought were happening. It's hard to talk about this without spoilers. It's just that there were certain gut punching moments at the end of that book that had me so scared. In A Dance with Dragons, I guess I should go ahead and mention the theme of leadership popped up a little bit more, especially regarding gender and how two different leaders in two parts of the world are dealing with two different styles of leadership based on the type of people they're trying to lead, the cultural differences, but also the gender differences between the leaders. And so that was very prominent for me upon reread. Now I'm going to talk about a standalone I reread via audio, and that is Guns of the Dawn by Adrian Tchaikovsky. So this particular book follows a character named Emily Marshwick, and it's kind of a blend of Pride and Prejudice meets Flintlock fantasy. I would say that the interesting thing about this particular book is it explores women in the military, it explores class, gender, propaganda, and I would say that upon reread, all of those things stuck out to me, including how satisfying the ending of this book is. But there were also certain little details about what war does to a town, to its people, that stood out to me also on reread. If my memory serves me right, I think that one little criticism I had of this book is that I thought Emily Marshwick, while an interesting character, I thought she seemed a little bit too reserved for me at times. I wanted to see her mess up a little. I wanted to see her maybe melt down at least once. I think she developed for me more as I read on in the book, but I just remember that being a thing. And then upon reread, it didn't bother me as much because I think I was set up for that. But one thing that did stand out to me upon reread, so I think I actually liked her maybe a little more on reread, and I think the audiobook narrator, by the way, helped with that. But upon reread, I think that the world stood out to me. I appreciated the swamp setting in that story, but I felt like it wasn't a world I necessarily wanted to return to. I didn't feel like there was anything that really stood out about it that made it really remarkable. I didn't feel like that was the big highlight of the story, which is fine. There were several other good things about the book, but the setting, there were some elements that were introduced that were different, but they weren't really developed as much. And it was a standalone. So maybe if those elements were developed, maybe it wouldn't work as a standalone. Those are just some things that come to mind. But I think that it's pretty even as far as how I felt about it the first time and how I feel about it now. And I still highly recommend it if you want a good Flintlock fantasy book. And if you want a really interesting storyline with a satisfying plot, this is a great one to pick up. And I really enjoyed Adrian Tchaikovsky's writing style in this book too. It's very easy to read, very efficient prose. So check this one out if you want a good solid standalone. Midnight Tides, Book 5, and Malazan Book of the Fallen by Stephen Erickson was another book that I reread this year. I was going to be in a discussion about this book, and it didn't end up happening, but I'm still glad that I got to this. I reread it via audio, and there are several things to say about this, and I'll try to keep my thoughts brief here. But some of the themes of this book really got to me the first time I read it a few years ago. I do have a spoiler filled review of this book when I first read it. And I would say that the theme of reciprocity, whether you give something and expect something in return. There's a culture that's introduced in book 5, the Lethery culture, where they are all about the language of debt and pulling strings to get more, to gain more. It's all about avarice, all about greed. And there's also this idea that that's just the natural law, that humans just aren't altruistic, that they're naturally selfish. And I know that there's actually some conversation about that nowadays, that humans are naturally selfish, but I like that this book takes a critical view of this perspective and invites us to examine ourselves. There's also trauma that's explored in this book. There are a lot of heavy things that are explored in this book, but there's also a tremendous amount of humor and some of the best characters in the series are introduced in this book, in my opinion. But here's the thing too about the humor. I laughed out loud a lot more the first time I read the book, maybe because I needed the humor more. I'm not sure. But this time around, I still thought it was funny, don't get me wrong, but I wasn't like laughing out loud as much upon reread for whatever reason. But what I appreciated about the reread experience was not only examining these themes again, but it was the way in which I could explore how this story sets up where we're going in the series, and also just noticing where Malazan Book of the Fallen ends up, how we finish things off with the crippled god, and how that reframes the way you look at this book. And I don't want to say too much because I feel like I'm going to give away spoilers if I try to explain this. But you could start to examine why Erickson chooses the themes he chooses and why he chooses the characters he chooses and the particular relationships between characters that he chooses. Now, did I enjoy this book more upon reread? I don't know that I enjoyed it more upon reread, but I loved it just as much. I resonated with it deeply. I felt like I needed it. There was something in me that felt like I need this book. I need to explore these themes. I know I sound repetitive at this point, so I'll just close this by saying I really loved it the first time, loved it the second time, and I would definitely consider rereading it again someday. The next book is Stranger with My Face by Lois Duncan. I loved this book when I was 9 or 10 years old, loved it in my 20s, and I loved it this year via audio. So this was a reread via audio. I used to own a copy of this book and I don't know what happened to it, but this follows a 17-year-old girl named Lori Stratton. I remember when I was a kid, I wanted to be Lori Stratton. She ends up in with the popular kids at her high school. She rides a ferry to school every day off the island where she lives. When one day she gets really sick and she was invited to this popular kids party, so she can't go to the party. The next day, her friends are mad at her and her boyfriend as well because they say, "What were you doing? We saw you last night at the beach. You weren't sick." And she said, "Yes, I was. I was sick." So it turns out there was a stranger with their face. It's a big mystery, but this book deals with out of body experiences and it's actually pretty well researched on that topic. It was written quite a while ago, I think in the early 80s. So keep that in mind. There is some cringy stuff in the book. There might be a couple of little plot conveniences here and there, but I just love the little details in this book, including the manor where Lori lives, which is overlooking some cliffs off the ocean. And in this manor, it's divided into a couple of different wings. So there's a wing in the house where her mother goes and paints all day, and the other wing where her father writes sci-fi novels. And at the end of the day, they meet in the kitchen to say, "Hi, honey, how was your day?" It's kind of cheesy, but I love those little descriptions, those little details. I was just immersed. I was immersed in the story. I really like I said, the kind of darker notes in this book, even though it's YA. I really love the way it ended. This held up upon reread. Surprisingly, I really thought I would cringe a lot. And like I said, while some things might have been a little cringeworthy here and there, I still love the book. Don't care. This book to mention is Stoner by John Williams. So this was a favorite for me in 2022. And I reread it via audio. I did listen to the audiobook the first time as well. I picked it up because I heard Jimmy and Alan talk about it on Chatting with Nuts, and Jimmy mentioned it was free on Audible. I had heard of the book beforehand, just to be clear. But yes, that definitely made me instantly pick up the book. This is about an English college professor, William Stoner, and it follows his life. When he starts out in the book, he comes from a farm. His parents send him off to the university to study agriculture, and then he finds out he's in love with literature. This book explores his life and his trials as a university college professor, as well as his challenges with his marriage and home life. It's about compromise, it's about standing by your principles at the right time, when to do one, when to do the other, when to make mistakes, how to live with regret. And it's also about love, discovery of self, discovery of passion. There is so much about this book that I absolutely adore. And it sounds like a very simple, boring premise, but for me, it was everything. I loved it so much. And the moment that I knew I was in love with this book the first time, that moment that he has the revelation, it was not actually him that has the revelation. It's his English college professor who tells him, "You're in love. You're in love with literature," essentially. So It was that moment actually that I ended up texting my mom, or maybe I called her and I said, "Mom, you need to pick up this book now." And she was fairly new to audiobooks at the time. So she picked it up. I finished the book and then I went to visit her. She was still listening to the book. So I was around when she was listening to it. So I kind of reread it 3 times in a way. Well, at least the second half I reread. She loved that book on the level that I think she loved Crime and Punishment that much. Like she and I, we cannot say enough good things about this book, and I reread this book to prepare for another discussion, and the discussion did end up happening. The discussion happened over on Alan's channel, and it was so much fun. It was such a special discussion with Jimmy and Murphy and Philip, and so, yeah, amazing, amazing upon reread. I think that there were certain details that came out to me more upon reread than the first time I read the book, including Stoner's relationship to the outer world. It is something I pointed out in my review the first time I read the book, but it's something that came out to me or stood out to me a little bit more and maybe in a slightly different way upon reread. And there were certain quotes that stood out to me more at the beginning of the book upon reread. I love this book so much. So, yeah, it held up just as much upon reread. So, what did I learn from this experience? I learned that my reading taste is maybe reliable. I don't know if that's totally true, but all these books were favorites the first time I read them again. They all held up on reread. And I would say I loved them just as much upon reread. I don't think I can say that I loved any of these books more upon reread. There might have been certain parts that I appreciated more upon reread, but as far as, like, the emotion level, I think the emotion level was around the same level, just it was just a different experience, though. There's something special about experiencing a book the first time. You just can't replace that experience. There's nothing quite like exploring a character the first time, a revelation a character has the first time, a plot twist the first time, a world the first time. There is so much about the first time you experience something, the novelty of that experience, but there's also something really special about returning to something familiar, to re-experience it, and also to notice what the author is doing. And I'm not saying I'm an expert on this, but I do appreciate asking myself, why did the author choose to use these characters in this situation in this way, or explore the theme in this way? Or even to notice the foreshadowing elements or notice the way certain things are set up for the climactic moments to occur. So there are things I feel like I can appreciate on reread that are easier to appreciate on reread than it is the first time I read a book. Though I'm trying to train myself to do those things even upon first read nowadays. So both reading experiences were special, but again, I don't think that I appreciated one more than the other. They were just different. But that is it for now. Let me know your thoughts down below on this topic. Do you love rereading books? Have you found that your enjoyment is just as strong upon reread? I know people who love A Song of Ice and Fire like I do tend to love the reread experience too. So please let me know your thoughts down in the comment section below. And thank you so much for watching. Have a great rest of your day. Bye bye.